Commander Christopher Reed stood at rigid attention inside the gleaming command center of Nexus Station, the sprawling interstellar hub bustling with trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange among dozens of alien species. His muscular physique, sculpted from years of military discipline and rigorous security assignments, stretched impressively against his tight black sleeveless shirt, complemented by dark cargo pants and combat boots, an imposing figure of human authority. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Christopher addressed Director Phelps, a stern-faced human diplomat with salt and pepper hair who oversaw Earth's interests on this far-flung alien outpost. "Reed," Phelps nodded grimly, turning away from a holographic star map. "I've got a special assignment for you, one that's particularly challenging." "I specialize in challenging," Christopher replied confidently, his gaze steady. "Not like this," Phelps sighed, activating a file on his console. A holographic image of a striking young woman appeared, her emerald skin shimmering gently beneath cascades of silvery hair. Her vibrant eyes sparkled mischievously, hinting at trouble. "Meet Lady Illyria the Laren, daughter of High Counselor the Laren from the Verdant Conclave." Christopher studied the image warily, instincts already warning him of the complications ahead. "She's here on a diplomatic exchange," Phelps continued, rubbing his temples. "But she's been problematic, to put it mildly. 3 security officers have already requested reassignment. She believes station regulations don't apply to her, and you want me to babysit her," Christopher remarked flatly. "I want you to ensure she doesn't cause an interstellar incident," Phelps said firmly. "The Conclave is a critical ally. We can't afford any diplomatic fallout, but neither can we tolerate her disruptions." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, sir, I'm trained for combat, not handling spoiled aristocrats. This isn't negotiable." Phelps's voice hardened. "You've handled difficult situations before, and your background in xenopsychology might give you an edge the others lacked." Christopher exhaled slowly, knowing he couldn't refuse. "When do I start?" "Immediately. She's waiting in Diplomatic Suite 17. Phelps paused, offering a final warning. "And Reed, try not to strangle her, no matter how tempting it gets." Christopher nodded curtly, turning on his heel and heading toward the diplomatic wing. The door to Suite 17 slid open smoothly, revealing luxurious accommodations and panoramic views of a vibrant, swirling nebula beyond. Before he could fully scan the area, a melodious, teasing voice spoke from behind. "Ah, they've sent another one." He turned slowly, confronting Lady Illyria the Laren lounging confidently on a plush sofa. Her emerald skin glowed beneath ambient lights, eyes twinkling with challenge. Clad in a provocatively styled black leather bodysuit, thigh-high boots, and matching gloves, she clearly sought a reaction. "Commander Christopher Reed, Station Security," he introduced himself coolly, maintaining his professional demeanor. She rose with feline grace, circling him slowly, examining every inch. "My, they've upgraded the model," she purred, tracing a gloved finger across his broad shoulder. "The last one was fragile. Let's see how long you'll last." Christopher remained motionless, voice firm. "I've reviewed your previous guard's experiences, Lady the Laren. I assure you, our relationship will have clearer boundaries." She laughed softly, like tinkling crystal. "Oh, I'm sure you'll try. They all do." He felt a subtle shift in atmosphere, sensing a game he hadn't yet mastered. As she poured herself a vibrant blue drink, casting a challenging glance his way, Christopher knew this assignment was anything but routine. However, he had no intention of becoming just another footnote in her long list of conquered guardians. "Well," Illyria smiled, raising her glass mockingly, "let the games begin." The first encounter, Christopher stepped into the luxurious diplomatic apartment, his eyes scanning the spacious room. The golden light from the setting sun filtered through the silk curtains, casting a soft, warm glow across the sophisticated furnishings. Every detail was meticulously crafted, from the polished wood floors to the antique paintings adorning the walls. Yet, despite the grandeur, it wasn't the decor that captured his attention, but the woman sitting gracefully in the center of the room, Illyria, her piercing eyes locked with his as she sat poised, her presence commanding and unsettling all at once. There was an air of challenge about her, a defiance that he could feel in the very air around him. She smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips, as if she already knew everything about him. "Christopher," she greeted, her voice a smooth melody, yet underlined with an edge of mischief. "I've been expecting you. Tell me, do you think you're up to the task?" Christopher didn't flinch. He stood still, maintaining an air of calm composure that had served him well in countless situations. His blue eyes, cold and unwavering, studied her every move. He knew exactly what kind of woman she was, intelligent, unpredictable, and dangerously charming. But what intrigued him most wasn't the challenge she presented. It was the mystery that surrounded her. "We will see," he replied, his tone neutral but firm. "This is a professional setting, Illyria. If we're to work together, we need to be clear about our roles and boundaries." She arched an eyebrow, her smile never fading. "Boundaries?" she repeated, almost mockingly. "How very conventional of you." Christopher held her gaze, his mind sharp and focused. He had dealt with difficult people before, but Illyria was different. She didn't just test limits, she reveled in pushing them to the extreme. And yet, something about her drew him in. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but then again, the most rewarding challenges rarely were. The cat-and-mouse game. Over the following days, Illyria made it her mission to push every one of Christopher's buttons. She knew exactly what strings to pull, what words to say, and what actions to take to unnerve him. From causing delays in important meetings to planting subtle doubts in his mind with cleverly worded remarks, she orchestrated chaos at every turn. It was as if she were trying to break him, to force him to show a weakness, but Christopher remained unshaken. He had seen much worse in his career, and he wasn't about to let a woman like Illyria get under his skin. Each time she crossed a line, he met her with an unwavering calm, countering her provocations with steady control. Where she tried to manipulate, he set boundaries, clear, firm, and unyielding. When she pushed, he pulled back. When she tested, he stood his ground. He never raised his voice, never showed a hint of frustration. His discipline was a fortress, and every time she tried to breach it, he reinforced its walls. It wasn't about winning for him. It was about maintaining control, about proving that no matter what game she played, he was always one step ahead. Yet, for all her efforts, Illyria couldn't help but be intrigued. The more she tried to unsettle him, the more she found herself fascinated by his composure. There was something magnetic about him, something that kept her coming back for more. Her challenges, once playful, were beginning to feel like a game of strategy, each move calculated to test not just his patience, but his very character. As the days wore on, Illyria found herself increasingly captivated by Christopher. She had thought him predictable, just another rigid, disciplined man. But the more she engaged with him, the more she realized how wrong she had been. His patience wasn't weakness, it was strength. His control wasn't a lack of emotion, it was mastery of it. And as she sat across from him one evening, watching him as he calmly sipped his drink, she couldn't help but wonder, was this a game? Or was it something more? Something neither of them had expected. Illyria smiled to herself, the corners of her lips curling in quiet amusement. She had started this game, but she wasn't sure anymore who was really in control. The evening began innocently enough. A few jokes here and there, a small disagreement over a topic she knew would be touchy, nothing that couldn't be smoothed over with a few charming words. But as the night wore on, Illyria's actions grew bolder. She walked up to the foreign ambassador she had been targeting for weeks, a man whose influence was growing in international circles. With a smile that could melt ice, she whispered something in his ear, something so provocative, so carefully chosen, that it immediately set the room on edge. The ambassador's face flushed with color, his eyes darting nervously to the surrounding guests. Illyria's words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. And soon the whispers began to spread like wildfire. What had she said? No one knew for certain, but the effect was immediate. Conversations faltered, guests shifted uneasily in their seats, and all eyes began to drift toward Christopher, who had been watching the scene unfold from the other side of the room, his jaw tightened, and he immediately moved toward the center of the room, where Illyria stood with an air of satisfaction, watching the chaos she had stirred. She knew exactly what she had done, and now the spotlight was on Christopher. He could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, waiting for him to take control of the situation, to restore order. But as he made his way through the crowd, Illyria wasn't finished yet. As if on cue, she took it further. Without hesitation, Illyria stepped forward, deliberately interrupting an important discussion between two dignitaries. She raised her voice, making a pointed remark about the legitimacy of the entire event. "How much of this is really about diplomacy?" she asked loudly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Or is it just a game of power and politics?" The room fell into stunned silence. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to respond to her sudden outburst. Illyria's words had cut through the facade of the evening's carefully curated civility, and now the truth hung in the air like a thick fog. She had just opened the floodgates to a dangerous conversation, one that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. Christopher could feel the heat rising in his chest. This wasn't just a flirtatious challenge or a minor disruption, it was a calculated attack. Illyria was pushing him into a corner, daring him to do something. The tension between them had reached a boiling point. The subtle games they had been playing for weeks had morphed into something more dangerous. Something that couldn't be ignored. He reached her side in moments, his expression cold and unreadable. Illyria met his gaze with an unapologetic smirk, clearly enjoying the chaos she had unleashed. "Illyria," Christopher's voice was calm but stern, his tone carrying the weight of years of experience in handling difficult situations. "This is not the place for your games." She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Oh. And what will you do about it, Christopher?" Her voice was almost too sweet, but there was no mistaking the challenge in her words. The room watched in rapt attention, their eyes flicking between the two of them. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. As if the entire evening had come down to this one moment. Christopher, despite the fire that burned beneath his composed exterior, kept his voice steady. "Enough," he said, his gaze unyielding. "You've gone too far." Before she could respond, he grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with a firm grip, and guided her through the sea of guests. There was no room for negotiation, no opportunity for Illyria to squirm free. The guests parted silently, their eyes following them as the tension continued to build. It was rare, almost unheard of, for someone to challenge the decorum of an event like this, and even rarer for someone to be so forcefully removed. Once outside, in the dimly lit hallway, Christopher stopped. He turned to face her, his stance rigid, his eyes dark with intensity. "Illyria," he said, his voice low but edged with authority, "you have crossed a line tonight. You've done more than test me, you've endangered everything we've worked for. This is no longer a game." Illyria stood before him, her chest rising and falling with the rapid beat of her heart. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a shiver of respect, maybe even fear. This was different. This wasn't the Christopher who had patiently endured her games. This was the man who had drawn a line in the sand and was prepared to defend it. "I didn't mean to," she began, but he interrupted her, his gaze unwavering. "No excuses," he cut her off. "You wanted to see how far you could push me. Well, you found your answer. There will be no more warnings, Illyria. This ends now. If you continue this behavior, you'll have no place here. No place in this world we've built." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the weight of his words, and Illyria felt something shift within her. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She had expected him to back down, to retreat into his usual calm. But instead, he had stood firm, his authority unshaken. She had underestimated him. And now, for the first time, Illyria found herself at a crossroads. The game had changed. And though she didn't admit it out loud, part of her was exhilarated by the challenge he had just laid down. Christopher turned on his heel and started to walk away, but before he reached the door, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. His voice, though softer, still held an undeniable edge. "This is your final warning, Illyria. Test me again, and you'll find out just how far I'm willing to go." Illyria stood still, watching him leave. She could still feel the intensity of the moment, the echo of his words ringing in her mind. She had pushed him, and he had responded with the full force of his authority. There was no turning back now. The game had become something much more dangerous, and Illyria was no longer sure who was truly in control. Attack on Nexus. The silent expanse of space outside Nexus Station was suddenly shattered by the roar of engines and the flashing of weaponry. Krell mercenaries, ruthless and well-armed, had launched a brutal assault on the space station. Their ships, sleek and deadly, tore through the void like predators hunting their prey. As alarms blared across the station, chaos erupted within the walls of Nexus. Christopher and Illyria were among the first to respond, but the attack was swift, overwhelming. Illyria, with her quick mind and even quicker reflexes, immediately recognized the danger. She wasn't just another diplomat or negotiator here, she was a target. Her presence, her position, made her a prime objective for the Krell mercenaries. In the control room, Christopher's hand hovered over the emergency protocols, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't let Illyria face this alone. There was something about the situation, something that pushed aside their previous tensions. With no time to second-guess, he grabbed her arm and pulled her into the narrow corridor outside. "Illyria," he shouted over the sound of explosions and gunfire. "We need to get to the lower levels. Now." She didn't argue. Her usual defiance was gone, replaced by a shared understanding of the danger they were in. They ran down the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoing in the tight, metallic corridors. As they ducked into a maintenance access tunnel, Christopher could hear the distant thrum of mercenary boots pursuing them. Their only option was to move quickly, stay ahead, and pray the station's defenses would hold long enough to keep the Krell at bay. The narrow hallways of Nexus became a maze. Each turn, each corner, presented a new challenge, but there was an unspoken bond growing between them in this shared danger. Christopher could feel the weight of his duty and the growing awareness that he was, for the first time, genuinely concerned for her safety. And Illyria, despite her usual arrogance and confidence, was starting to trust him, no longer just as an ally, but as someone she could rely on in the face of deadly peril. "I didn't think you'd come for me," Illyria muttered as they ran, her breath quickening. The sound of blaster fire ricocheted off the walls, sending a shiver down her spine. "I wouldn't leave you to die," Christopher replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Not like this." The danger, the adrenaline, had stripped away all the masks they had worn. There was no room for games now. Only survival. Battle and sacrifice. They reached the maintenance bay, a vast area filled with storage crates and repair equipment. The door slammed shut behind them just as a burst of gunfire rattled against the reinforced walls. Illyria took a deep breath, her mind working in overdrive. The station's gravity generator was failing, and without it, everything on Nexus would soon be sucked into the cold, empty vacuum of space. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected to feel in the heat of battle. Fear. Real fear. Not for herself, but for the innocent people still trapped in the station's upper levels, the ones she hadn't been able to save. "Illyria, we need to move," Christopher said. His voice urgent as he glanced at the access panel on the wall. "The escape pods are this way." But Illyria was already moving in the opposite direction, toward a control panel that was displaying a blinking red warning. She knew what had to be done. The station's core reactor was unstable, and it would take a dangerous maneuver to prevent it from going critical. But Illyria had one skill that no one else could replicate, her ability to manipulate the energy fields within Nexus, to bend the very systems of the station to her will. Christopher caught sight of her intentions and immediately stepped forward. "Illyria, stop. It's too dangerous." She didn't respond. Instead, she activated a series of complex commands on the panel. her fingers moving with precision. The station began to hum with energy, and the temperature in the room dropped as the emergency cooling systems kicked in. But then, an explosion from the Krell forces rocked the walls, sending a shockwave through the maintenance bay. Illyria staggered, her hand slipping from the controls as she fell to the ground, blood trickling from a wound on her side. Illyria. Christopher's voice was filled with desperation. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding as he knelt beside her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm fixing it," she whispered, her voice strained as she tried to push him away. "I can stop the reactor from detonating, but I need to keep the systems running." "Not like this," Christopher said, his eyes dark with worry. He could see that the effort was taking a toll on her, her usual vitality draining away with each passing second. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her from the cold floor. "You don't have to do this." She met his eyes, and for a moment, something shifted between them, a raw understanding. She didn't have a choice. No one else had the knowledge, the skills to stabilize the station. She had to act, and if it meant risking her life, she was willing to make that sacrifice. For the lives of everyone aboard Nexus, Christopher wasn't willing to lose her, not after everything they had been through. He would fight to protect her, no matter the cost. With one swift motion, he lifted Illyria, carrying her toward the escape pods. The blast doors to the control room were nearly closed, the Krell closing in. They were running out of time. The door to the escape pod opened just as another explosion rocked the corridor. Christopher pushed Illyria into the pod, then turned to face the oncoming mercenaries. His decision was already made. "Illyria," he said softly, his voice full of both finality and tenderness. "I'll hold them off. You get to safety. I'll be right behind you." She reached out, grabbing his arm. "Christopher, don't," but it was too late. He was already stepping away, his eyes locked with hers, a silent promise between them. He wouldn't leave her. Christopher turned, stepping into the line of fire, his body blocking the pod's entrance as the door began to close. He raised his weapon, his stance resolute, ready to do whatever it took to protect her. Illyria watched him, her heart in her throat. He had saved her life once before, and now he was saving it again. In this moment, everything had changed. The bond between them had deepened, solidified in the fires of battle and sacrifice. The pod launched, escaping the crumbling station, but Christopher remained behind. The consequences and the choice. The meeting was arranged in a lavish, private suite, one that Illyria had once walked through with pride, a space she had grown accustomed to in her privileged life. But today, the suite felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and the air was thick with something heavier than the normal family tension. High Counselor Thalarin, her father, sat in a high-backed chair, his posture as imposing as ever. His eyes, sharp and calculating, never wavered as they met Illyria's, who stood by the window, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. It wasn't the first time her father had discussed her future. After all, she had known from a young age that her life would never truly be her own. But today was different. Today, her father wasn't just speaking about alliances or political benefits. He was speaking of a binding contract. "Illyria," Thalarin began, his voice low and measured, "you've reached the age where decisions must be made. Your political future has been set in motion, and it's time to embrace what's been arranged." Illyria's chest tightened. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, the reality felt suffocating. She had always been more than just a political pawn in her father's eyes, but as she stood there, the weight of his words made her feel like nothing more than a vessel to further his influence. "I don't want this," she replied. Her voice quiet but fierce. "I won't be married off to some stranger as a political tool." Thalarin's gaze hardened. "You have a duty to this family, Illyria. This marriage will secure our standing and ensure our influence. It's not about your feelings, it's about the greater good." Her hands clenched at her sides, and she turned away, staring at the cold view outside the window. The stars in the distance seemed so distant, so unreachable, much like her hopes for freedom. She had always dreamed of a life beyond the constraints of her father's plans, but now it seemed like nothing more than a fantasy. That night, she sought comfort where she knew she could find it. She didn't want to be alone in her misery, and Christopher, despite the tension between them, had become a surprising source of solace. He was someone who had seen her at her worst, yet still remained steadfast by her side. And, for the first time in her life, she needed someone who understood. She found him in the quiet of the corridor, standing near the entrance of the maintenance bay. His eyes softened when he saw her approach, and without a word, he stepped aside to let her in. "Christopher," she began, her voice trembling, "I can't do this anymore." His brow furrowed with concern, and he gently guided her to sit. "Do what, Illyria?" She sighed, the tears she had been holding back now threatening to spill over. "My father has arranged a marriage for me. It's not just a simple arrangement, it's a political move, a strategy. I'm just a pawn in his game. I don't have a say in any of this. And I don't know what to do." Christopher sat beside her, his presence calm and steady. He didn't offer any empty words of comfort. But instead, his gaze met hers with a depth that made her feel seen, truly seen. He didn't judge her or offer sympathy. Instead, he listened, and for the first time, Illyria felt like she wasn't alone in her struggle. "You've never been just a pawn, Illyria," he said quietly. "You've always been more than that. You're strong, you're capable, and you deserve to make your own choices." She looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words. "But what choice do I have? My father's decision is final. He controls everything, my future, my destiny. I'm trapped." Christopher's hand found hers, his grip reassuring. "You don't have to accept what he's giving you. I know it's hard, but you have options. The only question is, what do you want to do?" Her heart clenched in that moment. What did she want? The question seemed so simple, yet so impossible to answer. Illyria had spent so much of her life under her father's shadow, her future dictated by his whims. For the first time, she realized that she had the power to choose her own path. But it terrified her. "I don't know what I want anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I do know I don't want this life. Not the one he's planned for me. I can't live like this." Christopher squeezed her hand, his eyes full of understanding. "Then you don't have to." Illyria turned to him, her heart racing as she searched his eyes. "Will you help me, Christopher? Help me find a way out of this?" He nodded. "I'll help you. Whatever it takes." And for the first time, Illyria allowed herself to believe that there might be a way out, a path forward that didn't lead to the life her father had mapped out for her. The mysterious conspiracy. Illyria's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions as she and Christopher set out to investigate the attack on Nexus. They both knew that the Krell mercenaries hadn't come just to attack the station, they were after something much more important. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that there was something darker at play, something that tied directly to her arranged marriage. They followed the trail of information, leading them to a secure facility that had once belonged to a former Krell commander. Inside, they found a series of encrypted files that detailed the mercenaries' objectives, including a surprising revelation: an assassination plot targeting Illyria herself. It wasn't just about the station's destruction, the attack was part of a larger scheme to eliminate her and ensure that the political marriage would proceed without any interference. "This is it," Christopher muttered as he scanned the encrypted data on his tablet. "Your father's marriage arrangement, it's not just political. It's a setup." Illyria's heart skipped a beat. "You mean, they're trying to kill me before the marriage happens?" Christopher nodded grimly. "Exactly. Someone's trying to ensure that the marriage goes through, no matter the cost." Determined to get to the bottom of this, they tracked down a surviving Krell mercenary who had been captured during the station's chaos. With a mixture of persuasion and intimidation, they managed to extract critical information from him. The mercenary, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, hesitated at first but eventually broke under the pressure. The one behind all of this. It's someone close to your father. A high-ranking official who wants the marriage to go through, someone who stands to gain everything if you're out of the picture. Illyria's blood ran cold. Her father's inner circle. Who could it be? There was only one person who could have the resources to orchestrate such a conspiracy, and Illyria feared she knew exactly who it was. The challenge of fate, the ancient halls of the Verdant Council were silent, a heavy air of expectation hanging over them. The council, those few who held the power to dictate the fates of entire empires, watched as Illyria stood at the center of the chamber, the ancient tomes of her ancestors scattered before her. Illyria's hands trembled slightly, but her gaze was unwavering. She had spent her life under the watchful eye of her father, subjected to his plans, to the ruthless games of politics. But now, she had the chance to change it all. With a single word, she could declare her own fate, no longer bound to a marriage that would strip her of her will. The challenge of merit, she whispered, her voice carrying through the room. It was an ancient tradition, a right that allowed a person to choose their own path, by proving their worth, by overcoming those who held power over them. This was her last chance to defy her father's will, to fight for the freedom she had always longed for. And to do so, she needed someone who would fight beside her. Illyria turned to Christopher, standing just a few paces behind her, his eyes full of understanding. This wasn't just about her, it was about them, about choosing each other in a world that had always tried to tear them apart. I choose Christopher, she declared, her voice ringing with finality. He will stand in my place against Admiral Pax in the challenge of merit. The murmurs in the chamber were almost deafening. Admiral Pax, a revered and feared figure, had the political backing of nearly every faction in the galaxy. No one expected him to lose, let alone to a man who had once been little more than a shadow in the halls of power. But Illyria wasn't just choosing Christopher because of his strength, she was choosing him because he had something more, honor, courage, and a heart she trusted. The council's eyes narrowed, some in disbelief, others in amusement. The rules were clear, the challenge would be a series of physical and mental tests, grueling trials that would push both men to their limits. And only the winner would gain the right to decide Illyria's future. Christopher stood tall, never once wavering under the weight of the decision. His loyalty to Illyria had been unwavering since the day he first stepped into her world, and now, as he prepared to face the most powerful man in the galaxy, his resolve hardened. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just a fight for her freedom, it was a fight for their future together. You've made your choice, Illyria. Admiral Pax's voice rumbled from the back of the chamber, his tone dripping with arrogance. But don't expect him to survive the trials. No one stands against me and wins. Illyria felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment that would define her life. And nothing, no threat, no power, could take that away from her. I trust Christopher with my life, she said, her voice steady. And I will not back down. The challenge begins now. Freedom and love, the arena where the challenge of merit would take place was unlike any place Illyria had ever seen. Massive, ancient stone pillars rose from the ground, their surfaces worn with the passage of time. The trials would take place in various arenas, each one testing not just the body, but the mind and spirit. Each task was designed to break those who were weak, to crush those who were unworthy. Yet, as Illyria watched Christopher step forward into the first trial, her heart swelled with hope. The first test was a battle of endurance. Both Christopher and Admiral Pax stood at the center of the arena, surrounded by obstacles that would push them beyond their physical limits. It was a test of sheer will, a fight to survive long enough to complete the challenge. Illyria held her breath as Christopher moved with fluid grace, dodging the assault of mechanical weapons and leaping over obstacles that threatened to crush him. Pax, by contrast, moved with raw power, brute strength, and an almost ruthless efficiency. For a moment, it seemed like Pax might prevail, but then, just as the admiral was about to deliver a crushing blow, Christopher reached for a nearby lever, triggering a trap that swung Pax into the path of a series of sharp, moving blades. With one final burst of strength, Christopher disabled the trap, leaving the admiral struggling to regain his composure. The crowd erupted in applause as Christopher, battered but victorious, stood tall. He had won the first trial, not by brute force, but by outsmarting his opponent, but the trials weren't over yet. The second trial tested their minds, challenging them with a series of complex puzzles that required both intelligence and strategy. Illyria watched from the stands as Christopher moved through each challenge with a calm precision that stunned even the seasoned members of the council. While Pax, for all his strength, struggled to keep up, Christopher seemed to move like a man who had been trained in the arts of survival, not just in combat, but in thinking ahead, in outwitting his enemies. As the final trial loomed, one that would test their resolve in a life-or-death confrontation, Illyria found herself at the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension in the arena was palpable. This was the moment when everything would be decided. Christopher faced Pax for the final trial. It wasn't just a fight, it was a test of will. To survive, they would both have to make a sacrifice. But it wasn't about brute strength or cunning anymore, it was about the heart. And Illyria knew, deep down, that Christopher had already won the challenge. He had fought for what he believed in, and he had fought for her. The battle was fierce, with every strike pushing both men to their limits. But as the final blow was struck, it was Christopher who stood victorious, breathless and bloodied, but unbroken. Pax, beaten and humbled, was forced to yield. The council stood in stunned silence as the verdict was announced. Christopher had won. He had proven himself worthy, and in doing so, had secured Illyria's future. Illyria rushed down to the arena, her heart full of relief and gratitude. She embraced Christopher, her arms wrapping around him as if to hold on to the one person who had never given up on her. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Free to make her own choices, free to live the life she had always dreamed of. The council, recognizing the depth of Christopher's character and the strength of their bond, granted their blessing. Illyria was no longer a political pawn. She was her own person, and with Christopher by her side, they would shape their future together. As they stood together, hand in hand, Illyria knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would still be challenges, still enemies to face. But with Christopher, her true ally, by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. In that moment, they were no longer bound by duty, by blood, or by the expectations of others. They were free, and they were united by love, trust, and a shared future.